Beginning April 12, 1861 with the firing on Fort Sumter, and continuing until April 14, 1865 with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the month of April was witness to numerous events in Civil War history. In this episode of History by the Month, we explore some of those events, beginning with the first event of the Civil War. April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fire on Fort Sumter. 7 states, including South Carolina, had seceded from the U.S. months earlier. Attempts by President James Buchanan to supply U.S. troops at Fort Sumter had failed, and when newly inaugurated President Abraham Lincoln told South Carolina's governor that he too would try to supply U.S. troops at the fort, South Carolina demanded all U.S. troops evacuate Fort Sumter immediately. U.S. troops did not. So, at 4:30 a.m. on April 12th, Lieutenant Henry S. Farley fired a single 10-inch mortar round from Fort Johnson. The shell exploded over Fort Sumter as a signal to open the general bombardment from 43 guns and mortars at Fort Moultrie, Fort Johnson, the Floating Battery, and Cummings Point. Under orders from Confederate Commander Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard, the guns fired in a counterclockwise sequence around the harbor, with 2 minutes between each shot. Beauregard wanted to conserve ammunition, which he calculated would last for only 48 hours. Fort Sumter commander Major Robert Anderson held his fire, awaiting daylight. His troops reported for a call at 6 a.m. and then had breakfast. At 7 a.m., Captain Abner Doubleday fired the first shot of retaliation. Given the available manpower and limited supplies, Anderson could not take advantage of all 60 of his guns. He deliberately avoided using guns that were situated in the fort where casualties were most likely. The fort's best cannons were mounted on the uppermost of its 3 tiers, the barbette tier, where his troops were also most exposed to incoming fire from overhead. The fort's central flagpole was knocked down at 1 p.m. on April 13. Colonel Lewis Wigfall, a former U.S. Senator, had been observing the battle and decided this indicated the fort had endured enough. He commandeered a small boat and, waving a white handkerchief from his sword, met with Major Anderson. Knowing he was dangerously low on ammunition and satisfied his troops had defended their post with honor, Anderson agreed to a truce and formally surrendered the fort to Confederate personnel at 2:30 p.m. on the 13th. Major Anderson and his men were allowed to strike their colors, fire a salute, and board a ship bound for New York, with Anderson carrying the Fort Sumter flag with him. The Confederate victory at the Battle of Fort Sumter resulted in enormous support for military action from both the North and South. President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion, while 4 more states joined the Confederacy, including Virginia. On April 20, Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee resigned from the U.S. Army to take command of all Virginia forces. Over the course of the next year, gains and losses were made by both Union and Confederate forces, with more Union success in the West than in the East. One example of Union success in the West occurred 1 year later, in April 1862. April 6 and 7, 1862, forces led by General Ulysses S. Grant win the Battle of Shiloh. After Union victories at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in February 1862, Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston withdrew from Kentucky and left much of the western and middle of Tennessee to the Federals. This permitted Major General Ulysses S. Grant to push his troops toward Corinth, Mississippi, the strategic intersection of the Mobile and Ohio Railroad and the Memphis and Charleston Railroad, and a vital troop and supply conduit for the South. Alerted to the Union Army's position, Johnston intercepted the Federals 22 miles northeast of Corinth at Pittsburgh Landing. The encounter would prove devastating, not only for its tactical failure, but for the extreme number of casualties. At daybreak on April 6, 3 corps of Confederate infantry storm out of the woods and sweep into the southernmost Federal camps, catching Grant's men unprepared. Intense fighting centers around Shiloh Church as the Confederates sweep the Union line from that area. Despite heavy fire on their position, Union troops counterattack, but slowly lose ground and fall back northeast toward Pittsburgh Landing. Throughout the morning, Confederate brigades forced Grant's troops into defensive positions, including a treacherous thicket of oaks posthumously named the Hornet's Nest by fortunate survivors. That afternoon, while leading attack on the left end of the Union's Hornet's Nest line, Johnston is shot in the right knee. The bullet severs an artery, and the commander bleeds to death. General P.G.T. Beauregard is appointed the new Confederate commander. Believing his army victorious, he calls a halt to the attacks as darkness approaches. He is unaware that overnight, General Buell's Army of the Ohio arrives with reinforcements for Grant. The Union Army now has nearly 54,000 men near Pittsburgh Landing and outnumbers Beauregard's army of around 30,000. The next day, Grant's army launches their attack at 6 a.m. Beauregard immediately orders a counterattack. The Confederates are ultimately compelled to fall back and regroup along their line. Beauregard orders a second counterattack, which halts the Federals' advance, but ultimately ends in a stalemate. The timberclads USS Tyler and USS Lexington provide naval artillery support to Grant's left flank from the Tennessee River. By mid-afternoon, Beauregard realizes he is outnumbered, and having already suffered tremendous casualties, retreats toward Corinth. Union losses are so heavy, they do not pursue. The battle has significant impacts. The South's defeat ended the Confederacy's hopes of blocking the Union advance into Mississippi and doomed the Confederate military initiative in the West. The victory further secures the career of Ulysses S. Grant and allowed Union troops to penetrate the Confederate interior, though at a great price. The carnage was unprecedented, with the human toll being the greatest of any war on the American continent up to that date. After Shiloh, both sides realized the magnitude of the conflict would be longer and bloodier than they could have imagined. Events in the eastern theater of the war were going better for the Confederate forces, including their unexpected success at the Battle of Chancellorsville, which began April 30, 1863. After Major General Ambrose Burnside's abject failure at Fredericksburg in December 1862, President Abraham Lincoln appoints General Joseph Hooker to take charge of the Army of the Potomac. Hooker's energetic makeover polished the Union Army into tip-top condition, and he declared them, quote, the finest army on the planet. With complete confidence, Hooker orchestrated what he called a perfect plan to confront Lee and drive him from his camp at Fredericksburg. Though outmanned, Lee did not retreat. He met Hooker's challenge head-on, engaging him in one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. Brilliant tactics by Lee and Stonewall Jackson thwarted Hooker's ambitions and resulted in a victory for the South. Chancellorsville is often described as Robert E. Lee's perfect battle, because his risky decision to divide his army in the presence of a much larger enemy force resulted in a significant Confederate victory. The victory was both a product of Lee's audacity and Union General Joseph Hooker's timid decision-making, and it was tempered by heavy casualties, including the loss of Lieutenant General Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson. Jackson was hit by friendly fire, requiring his left arm to be amputated. Days later, he died of pneumonia, a loss that Lee likened to losing his right arm. But buoyed by the outcome, Lee would later launch an offensive into Pennsylvania, where the opposing armies would meet on the battlefield in Gettysburg in July 1863. But over the course of 2 more years of fighting and a change in Union command to Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, the course of the war would inevitably and irrevocably trend to Union success. That success would be finalized on another date in April. April 9, 1865. Lee surrenders to Grant. As the sun rose on April 9th, Robert E. Lee still clung to the belief his war was not over. 2 days earlier, after the Confederates had suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Sailor's Creek, Grant asked Lee to surrender and declared any further effusion of blood was solely Lee's responsibility. But Lee, still believing he could escape Grant, declined to surrender and asked about the possibility of a peace agreement. Grant replied he could consider only a military surrender. Hopefully, Lee thought, there was only a thin line of Union cavalry ahead of him that he could smash through, find supplies and rations, and then turn south to march to North Carolina to continue the fight. Ulysses Grant had ridden west all morning toward the fighting, knowing he was drawing near to the end of the Army of Northern Virginia. Now, as the sun continued to rise, Lee's hopes were dashed by the arrival of thousands of Union infantry, including United States colored troops, who had marched most of the night to block his way south. By 8 a.m., Lee knows his war is over and sends a letter to Grant. Grant is south of Lee's army, in the outskirts of Appomattox County, when the message arrives. He sends Staff Officer Orville Babcock with his reply, agreeing to meet and telling Lee to select a meeting site. Lee dispatches Charles Marshall into the village to find a suitable home for the meeting. Marshall arrives at the property of Wilmer McLean, and after rejecting an abandoned unfinished building as unsuitable, McLean offers the use of his home. Sometime after 1 p.m., Lee arrives at the McLean house and waits with Marshall and Babcock. Grant and his staff arrive half an hour later. There is no formal surrender document. The surrender is conducted through an exchange of 2 short letters, Grant's a mere 5 sentences long, and Lee's reply bearing only 3 very short, terse sentences. The heart of the terms had already been outlined for Lee in letters the 2 generals had exchanged over the 2 previous days. By 3 p.m., it was over. The formal copies of the letters indicating the terms and acceptance of the surrender were signed and exchanged, and General Lee left the McLean house to return to his camp. The next day, Grant would meet briefly with Lee, hoping to persuade him to influence other Confederate forces to surrender, but Lee would refuse. Grant would leave Appomattox to continue the work of ending the war, and Lee would stay until April 12th, the day of the formal infantry surrender ceremony and the 4th anniversary of the first shot fired at Fort Sumter. 2 days later, on April 14th, John Wilkes Booth, as part of a conspiracy to revive the Confederate cause, would assassinate Lincoln, who died of his wounds the next morning. Booth himself would be killed at the end of a 12-day chase, and Confederate forces would continue to surrender until now President Andrew Johnson formally announced the end of the war on August 20th, 1866.